So thank you for joining me here at the Ineffable Else, where we explore the hidden energies. We can unwrap the mysteries of this universe through this artistic science and feel all along the way. So please subscribe to the channel and share this with anyone. I've poured a lot of my enthusiasm into this video, particularly. Please help this channel to grow. Join me and the wave of people using astrology to expand their consciousness into this new paradigm we are creating together. And please contact me if you would like to have a reading of your own. I hope you enjoy this video. Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. Thank you for joining me here in the garden. Today we're going to be looking at Donovan. This is a singer from the 1960s. That's when he was at his most famous, most prevalent. And yet he only came into the realm of my consciousness in the last year. So there's a few questions I need to ask and I would like to have answered by this investigation. One of them namely being how it's possible that someone of this caliber, and also with so much in common with other musicians that I was previously very obsessed with, managed to evade me. And is this perhaps a blessing that he has, that he didn't achieve the super fame of the likes of Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones and the other people he's associated with? Am I completely wrong? Is he this famous and I've just not noticed? It feels curious in that it seems like I have been living in a parallel reality, a parallel universe where he doesn't exist. Because all of a sudden, when I did hear of him and discover his music and everything, he seemed to be popping up in many different documentaries I was seeing, and his commentary was appearing in magazines in front of me, and his name was being mentioned in books I was reading, and I thought, how strange. He's suddenly very, very much, I'm very aware of this person now. And one of the most curious things is that he is a proponent of astrology. From a very mainstream location that he held, he named an album The Cosmic Wheels, and he spoke about astrology at a time when it was having a resurgence in the 1960s and then more into the 70s, as the age of Aquarius became a common expression and a common theme that most people had heard of. So I also would like to investigate that. He's 74 years old, so he's lived a full life. So I would be really curious to see his chart and to see what he did with the energy that he was born with. I also want to do this because I have become somewhat of a super fan in the space of 1 year. And I feel like one of the nicest ways you can show your appreciation for someone is through a really comprehensive reading, to show you really can see them and see all of their efforts and achievements and natural tendencies. So let's begin. He was born in Glasgow in 1946 on the 10th of May, which gives him this lovely Taurus sun. The first thing that jumped out at me is that it's in the 12th house. So there is this feeling that he is for us. This is why I don't feel so shy to address him and address his chart, because to a certain extent he was always made for the people. There are many things to address within his chart, namely the fact that although this sun is incredibly, and this is probably what gives him this popularity, is his sun is there for all of us to see. His mind is quick wit, his Mercury is also there, and yet the majority of his chart is down here in the very first few houses, and in the very personal houses, and also in personal signs. He has this
bowl shape to his chart. You know, it's all happening in just this one half. And it's a sign of an introvert, but it's also a sign of someone who's self-driven because it's in the left. Someone with more initiative, someone in charge of their own destiny, and someone who seeks balance. This is the thing when you kind of chop a chart in half like this, the main aim is to try and balance these two halves. There's already, before we even look at anything else that's happening, there's already a theme here to do with finding the other half and having a good balanced relationship with the world. Then we can see all of this in Libra over here, including Jupiter, which I also have natally, and I know that feeling of how you can expand in a relationship. And his wound is also there, the Chiron. So these are all things that we can look at as we go along this presentation. But there's already this key theme of relationship and having, you know, the other half of yourself sort of from a very early age. You want to find them, and you take great comfort in relationships. The other really key feature would have to be this ascendant conjunct with Venus. And I already knew this going in, that he was someone so soft and so loving and so beautiful. And you can hear it in his voice and you can hear it in his songs. And it evidently was Venusian. And then having a Taurus sun, Taurus is that one of the homes of Venus. And then all of the Libra activity just emphasizes the Venusian qualities. And if that wasn't enough, he also then has the planet of Venus conjunct his ascendant. And this, I feel, is a crux of why people find so much comfort in his music and in spending time with him, which is what you do when you listen to someone sing. You're actually just picking up their vibration and what it is to be them. And that's a very comforting thing to have, is to your appearance to the outside world is the planet which rules your chart. You know, when it's that aligned, there's no contradiction in that. It's a very beautiful thing. And it's interesting then he has all of this Gemini, and this is why Gemini is never any of the stereotypes it's being attached with. It's not a case of being gossipy or bitchy or being just in the mind or just in the mouth or just in the throat and things. Like, it really is mutable air, which means it's affected by whatever else is happening. And here he has the ascendant, Venus, Uranus and the North Node all in Gemini. So he's got a huge amount of Gemini energy, and with all that Libra in trine to it, like, it's really nicely helped and assisted with air upon air, which then gives that lovely Taurus sun. That grounded Taurus sun can be really stable because it's being assisted by a lot of flow, a lot of breezy easiness. The other main feature I'll just touch on now to begin with is the Virgo moon, and the Virgo moon is possibly my favorite position for the moon whenever I've been around it. My partner's moon sign is Virgo, and it really is so naturally self-sacrificing and so naturally wants to please others, just to create a really nice environment. It's mutable earth, it wants to share, and it's really harmonious. And because of the Taurus sun grounding this in the 12th house for everyone else, you know, Taurus sun can sometimes be super selfish, greedy and stuff, but this is just the sun for the rest of us to enjoy. And then the moon is just another earth element that keeps it all together. It's just beautiful. I'm so happy when I saw his chart. And so there we go. We'll start in 1960. So this is when he takes up guitar, when he's aged just 14. So he's born in Glasgow, and then when he's a teenager he moves down to Hertfordshire with his family. Comes from an old line of sort of troubadours and people, orators and Scottish folk songs, and it's just so natural for him to continue that tradition of storytelling. And he bursts in at the time when the beatniks, he's inspired by the beatniks, and he's trying to find his voice within all of that. And from a very young age, he gets fame. And I want to mention his right-hand man called Gypsy Dave. This is a man who was always by his side, and many of his early songs are about his journeys being homeless, sleeping in graveyards of Manchester and Torquay and St Ives, and just having some pretty transcendental experiences where you kind of lose the need for comfort and lose the need for much else other than just enjoying, just being young and being free, which as the 60s was unfolding was something that they could really engage with and expand more and more with every single day it was that passed. It's just such a pivotal decade, really incredible decade of change, really unprecedented. It set the foundations for the era that we live in now. So I wanted to mention Gypsy Dave because this is a man who really assisted him, and you can see it here. I've done a composite chart where Donovan is here in the red on this circle, if you can see this circle here, and then this is Gypsy Dave in the blue inside. So I've overlaid them together, and I just want to draw attention to a few different things that I picked up, which firstly is that lovely Virgo moon that Donovan has, which can kind of be a bit, with all the Taurus sun and the earth, it doesn't like moving that much. But then you bring Gypsy Dave along and he's got this Mars sitting right on top of his moon, which kind of gives them this really nice double act. And it's Mars, it's action. So it's like saying, yeah, you can play for us and our friends, but we can take this further. And something about the sun of Gypsy Dave being in Cancer means it's not about fame and fortune, and it really is about him taking care of his friend. And he's only born a couple of months after him, and I think that's really, really sweet. And you see how one point in Donovan's chart that is quite tender is his Saturn in Cancer. I have a video about this placement as being difficult because Saturn doesn't like emotion and Cancer is all about expressing it, so it can be quite emotionally suppressed, and especially with all the other people pleasing tendencies of Donovan's chart. The fact that his best friend has got a Cancer sun kind of helps him see that it's not this really, really bad thing. This is something that can be really embraced. It's something that Gypsy Dave has, and he's passed now, but I have this too, the conjunction of Pluto and Mercury, which can create a really penetrating mind. And you can certainly see with someone like Donovan him needing someone with a sharp mind and a sharp sense of because Pluto is so deep space and Mercury is so close and light and airy, to have those two things together can be really useful to get a fuller perspective of things. And if you're coming up at that age, and we are talking, like late teens, he's becoming successful, you need someone that you can trust and that can give you the best kind of feedback, and possibly in that moment really not a girlfriend, like a friend. And the really nice thing for Gypsy Dave, apart from being able to be with this beautiful musician, is that his moon is opposite this sun. He's got this Scorpio moon, which can be super intense and all over the place, but also deep. And then with Donovan's sun in Taurus, it's like these two balancing factors of masculinity, femininity, night and day, and both to do with values and both to do with assessing where we should put our attention. So it's this two halves of the same coin. The next thing I wanted to address was the big story with Bob Dylan. So Bob Dylan is 4 years older than Donovan, and there were lots of comparisons made between them and lots of people saying Donovan was a pretender, probably because he was younger and because a lot of his music, they were influenced by the same artists. So inevitably they ended up having a similar sound. And in that moment, Donovan's voice, he wasn't, really embraced fully the Celtic side of his singing. He was much more following in the footsteps of Woody Guthrie and a few more American artists, which was absolutely part of his evolution. But so was Bob Dylan. And there are some challenges made to Donovan in terms of authenticity in that moment. And on reflection, I wonder if he sees how beneficial that is to, he was just 18, here he is in America with Dylan, and to have, your sort of ego crushed like very young has probably been quite beneficial for him. And if you look at their lives in parallel, generally I would say that Donovan is far more happy than Bob Dylan has been. And here you can see this is taken from 1965 when he is just 18, and this is all kicking off, and you can see that his natal moon is being triggered here by Uranus, Mars, the moon, and Pluto. This is his birthday in 1965. And this is some deep and heavy challenges very early in life. And this is the thing with a lot of stuff happening in the first few houses, is he was always going to be challenged, and be really successful, and really live the bulk of his prime was going to be earlier than most for that reason. And Saturn is also opposing his moon and just challenging all of this, people pleasing, how much are you going to take, and are you going to react? It's like that poking the ego to see whether it could draw out a reaction. And it didn't. And it's really interesting when you see him in interviews now. I think people often feel he's being either too arrogant. They say, oh, not one name is left undropped when he speaks, but he really does just seem to speak the truth, and he doesn't add anything that would, he has flourish and flair to how he expresses himself, but in terms of the facts, he's never trying to big himself up or put himself down. It's always exactly as it was. And it seems that there's an idea of humility, which means that you should just kind of, oh yeah, no, that wasn't really me, that didn't really happen, when he's like, no, this is how it was. And there was this Dylan and Donovan competition type thing, and rather than commenting that it was a challenge, it's more oh well, that was an interesting sequence of events that happened. And he would make comments about the fact that Dylan and his crowd were all much more into amphetamines and into the kind of stimulant drugs. And whenever I look at Dylan, I feel it's caffeine and it's nervousness. And I feel like this is an important point to make about why is Dylan so much more famous? Why has he had a film made about him? And like, why was he inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1982 and Donovan wasn't until 2012? 2012 being a very important year. And not only that, but look, April the 14th. So within the Aries of, so as far as I'm concerned, it's the new year of 2012. Is that 60s thing coming back again? For the next sort of wave of the Aquarius unfoldment. So why is it that Bob Dylan is so much more popular? And you can see it in his expression. Like, this is a turbulent time, the 60s, 70s, 80s. This is a really, and it's funny because both him and Donovan, you could argue, they, well, created their best work in the 60s. And Dylan has definitely said that, like, I will never create anything as good as what I created in the 60s. And there was a huge spike in creativity at that moment. And it's really interesting that we hold these people in such esteem when they're really, like, they were boys and they were being able to express what people were feeling. And before that moment, music was not that available. We didn't have headphones. We weren't listening to music all day, every day. There were just a few voices that really got the airtime. And these were two of them, very powerful ones. But the thing with Dylan is there's so much more angst and so much more, I really see the jitter and the nervousness of the times, and not the bags under the eyes. It's not the same stability that Donovan has. That is maybe why Donovan is now having a resurgence, both now and then in 2012 when he did get that award. And so I've got Dylan's chart here, and we can look at it, and it's very sharp. It's super sharp, and you can see it in his pointiness, and it is a lot of Gemini, but it's also a lot of Taurus. So the fact that these two were sort of in a competition, you can understand why they were seen as so similar. A sun is just in Gemini here, but that is the thing that comes through. This is what I'm trying to get about the quality of Gemini, and it's like the Gemini is emphasized here with the Gemini mind being so quick-witted, and then Gemini way of loving where it's like this or that, or And I saw one image, I'll put it in the corner, where it's comparing the two and saying, well, what is Donovan? Oh, he's someone that who's chasing the same woman for 15 years. Basically, that he's a silly, he's super silly. Whereas Dylan, he's super sexy, had 15 girlfriends in 1 year. And just these comparisons is quite funny, because it's like, what were we putting up as a male vision of what was attractive? And in that moment, it was to be much more aloof, and it ain't me, babe. It's not about having that really open and flowy heart, even though we said that in the 60s, like we weren't ready. And if you watch the musical Hair, which was about the 60s, made in the 80s, like, it's cutting. I don't see much heart space stuff there. I see a lot of experimenting with drugs and a lot of opening up sexually, but breaking down the barriers, and it's a lot more Uranus, but it's not so much of the heart. Whereas with Donovan, it's much more about the heart, and it's only something we're kind of getting into a frequency with now. Whereas Dylan's so much more mental, so much more skittish, he's much more of a beatnik in that sense. And you can see the pointiness of his chart here. It's exactly the opposite realm from Donovan, where Donovan is much more grounded and much more about the collective and much more about himself as an individual, introverted. This is much more about, this is all happening in the 5th, 6th, 7th house, and he's messing around a lot with drugs and playing, and also just this sort of split personality that you can see in the film. I'm not really here, I'm not really there, and it's much trickier. And yeah, just a reflection of where we were at as a collective in that point. Ultimately, Donovan actually received an honorary degree from the University of Hertfordshire in 2003. So before he got his rock and roll fame, he got a degree. I feel sometimes honorary degrees are so much more real, because it's, you've done something and then we're going to give you this. Like at my graduation, it was the actor that played Voldemort, Ralph Fiennes. He came and he got his honorary award for everything he'd done, just because he'd been at my university for a year and then dropped out and then gone on to have a really successful career, and they want to pull him back and say, yeah, he's one of ours, we'll give you a degree. And the same goes for Donovan. So Hertfordshire gave him a degree. So how is it that this academic body could see something that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame couldn't? And he himself said it was he appreciates this award far more than the rock and roll thing. That the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is just a great way for him to his music to be exposed to a lot of more young people. And he said that the good thing about that is my music is full of love and positive things. So it's never been this kind of chasing fame thing, whereas with Dylan it's this nervousness of how famous are you going to get, and like a real reflection on what it is to be famous. Donovan goes along and he's, this is 1966 and he's just doing his thing, and his music is just evolving with this flower power feeling and sentiment of love and more psychedelia. And it's notable that the drugs he was experimenting with were mescaline, LSD and cannabis. He really wasn't into any of the heavy coke stuff. And that's really reflected in his mannerisms and his behavior and his general happiness. And I've always preferred, of all the Beatles, I've always been a Paul McCartney fan, and for a long time, you know, the obsession will be with John Lennon, and he's much more cutting and emotional, and it's what we needed. If you hear John Lennon's got an album about his parents and he's screaming about his mother, and that kind of emotional outburst is really powerful for us to address. And with these two, with Donovan and then with Paul McCartney, it's so much more of a softness and so much more of a gentleness, and yet it's their voices, I feel, are far more otherworldly and not so wrapped up in like ego, pain and trauma as Dylan and John Lennon were. And meanwhile, you know, Paul McCartney is singing songs "Let It Be" where he's talking with the dead, like his mother's come to him, and he just talks about these things quite matter of factly, you know, that we communicate through the realms. And again, it's that peace and tranquility that comes through in their music. So here we are in 1966 on the 10th of May again. So he's only 19 now. Donovan is like forming this relationship, this friendship with Paul McCartney, and he helped a lot of the influence of the Beatles, who are arguably one of the most famous bands in the whole world. And he was very, very influential to them and contributed a lot. And then he travels with them to India and it discovers more about meditation and the transcendental and the East and Eastern music and sitars and all what the psychedelic realm had opened up for him. And this is actually when he was there. He was there in February and March of in April of 1968. All through this time, Pluto is squaring his ascendant and everything that's happening for him with his North Node and everything in Gemini. So it's a challenging time, and he's constantly having to evolve and change himself. And he's only 21 years old, and he's discovering all of this stuff. And he's like the archetype of the young man who's able to go off and do this world exploration that is now, or has been up until the recent pandemic, has been something that people from the West have enjoyed, is this exploration of the East and exploration of other cultures and taking from it new ways of thinking and new ideas and new ways of playing and ways of living. And he has something in his chart which is self-knowledge, which is present throughout from his very earliest songs. You know, he's a Taurus and he's aware that the shadow side of Taurus is jealousy and greediness and lustfulness and wanting things and wanting possessions and being possessive. In songs where he says things like, "I know what a jealous trip can be." And even in more jokey ones, he says, "Your baby wants to steal my chocolate eclair." And when he delivers the line, you feel like, yep, you mean that for real. This is not just a chocolate eclair. This is more meaning to you than that. And that can grate on the soul. And the big story, the big love story, is a love triangle between one of the Rolling Stones members, Brian Jones, who died very young, and the mother of one of his children. He died very young, but he had many children. And he was a very outspoken and confident member of the Stones. Before he died, the woman that Donovan fell in love with, he encouraged her not to get together with Donovan because he's too immature. So this is a very powerful voice and a powerful opinion. He also had a lot to say about Dylan in relation to Donovan, very, very strong opinions. So it is challenging this Taurus sun and seeing how soft and gentle you can be. And this is always coming back to his moon and how accommodating and how patient you can be. Because he's got this quick-witted Aries mind. But when this stuff is happening over here in the 12th house, it's like taking your time little by little and waiting for the ripest moment, the ripest fruit, and not just greedily trying to take everything at once, but just giving it that rest and that time it needs. And he was writing songs like Sunshine Superman, where he says, "It will take time, I know, but in a little while you're going to be mine. We'll do it in style." So I've just had to come inside because of the battery on my laptop. And he was deeply in love with this woman called Linda Lawrence. And this is another example of someone else, like with Dylan, someone extremely successful who perhaps was shining more brightly in one moment, but who burnt out. And Linda Lawrence, after he died, she moved to America and she got into another relationship with another doomed superstar, one of the members of the Byrds, who also died from a drug overdose. And it's this slow and steady theme that Donovan's had to wait and wait and wait and wait. But then the harvest was very rich. Here's a quote. "I travelled to Japan and was set to stay out of the UK for a year and earn the largest fees yet for a solo performer, and all tax-free. At the time, the UK tax for us was 98%. So they were all being taxed huge amounts in the 60s as well, which is very interesting. Unprecedented at that time for someone who's a musician to be earning that amount of money that they need to be taxed 98%. During that Japanese tour, I had a gentle breakdown, which made me decide to break the tax exile. Millions were at stake. My father and my agent, they pleaded for me not to step onto a jet bound for London. But I did. I went back to my little cottage in the woods. 2 days later, a young woman came seeking a cottage to rent. It was Linda. He's also living all the way through the 60s and having all this success and then having challenges thrown at him, and being a sort of one of the initiators of this kind of life of young fame and success. And he's starting to feel how completely empty it is. And he can't be with the woman he loves. He can't be in his own country because he's in exile. So then it's actually thanks to Jip Mills, his best friend, the one with the cancer son, who encouraged him to go back to England and to look after your health and look after your mental health and not just continue just because there's money at stake. So he came back and he was rewarded by meeting and reuniting with Linda. Here they are, looking very enamored on, I imagine, their wedding day, which I found to be the 2nd of October 1970. So this is the start of a new decade for them. And I found this in an article. The pair reunited in 1970 in a touching scene involving a cow. We walked up to the woods, me with my guitar, and we sat in the field and we didn't say anything until I said, "Do you want to get married now?" And she said, "I still feel the same." And I started singing a song, and a cow came up and licked Linda's face while I was singing. I've never heard of anything like that happening, and you can't make that up. It must be a tourist thing. I just think there's this edge of humour the entire way through his life that has probably been his saving grace. It's just so funny. There's just the cosmic giggle. I've written that down a lot in the notes about him. And what's funny, you probably can't see it in that tiny little screen, but it's like, in terms of the colours, there's only one watery thing happening, which is Saturn in Cancer, which is kind of an oxymoron because it's difficult to float with the Saturn. But everything else is earth, air and fire, with a lot of air. And the fire is in all the right places to move and to progress and pursue action through performance. And I think the thing to remember about him and every one of these stars in that day is that they're all the Pluto and Leo generation. So it's all about how we come to the stage and how we perform and how we show ourselves. And I remember reading another article with him saying that he was just so amazed by the potential of performing on a television, and how that how you can captivate in that way by staring into a camera and reaching so many people at the same time in a really deep way, really touching way. And then later I almost see him get quite playful and cynical at the same time with the whole trope of screaming girls going crazy for a man with a guitar, and what does that mean? And it's this separation of, like, is it the anima or the animus, the male side of the psyche that we kind of deny as women, and then we hold it up in men and celebrate it because we can't celebrate it in ourselves. That's why we go so crazy for Justin Bieber's and things, and we scream and cry because we're projecting all of that repressed divine masculine onto this little figurehead sitting there with the guitar. But there is certainly something very, very magical. He's still only about 20, 24, 25 when he's had to wait all this time to get Linda back and to marry her. So it's all still happening within such a short space of time. He's not even had his Saturn return. But Saturn is sitting on top of his sun, and it's kind of calling him to be this family man and get out of any kind of need to be something cool and Bob Dylan-esque, and just into something of a family man. And I just think it's so, I mean, there's even a guinea pig in this photo, and it's just so truthful to the longer term trajectory beyond the 60s and what that was, and into something that is more of being the embodied divine masculine and putting the relationship first. The other thing I really wanted to point out was his midheaven being over here, right between, well, it's actually just within Capricorn. And the Capricorn is the father archetype, it is the grandfather, it is the grown up and learning to take the reins and be a figurehead. And I think it's really beautiful that he didn't go the way of so many other people who are dying from drug use, or went into some very, very existential crisis, or depression, or just selling out, or any of these things. And even I was investigating Cat Stevens a bit before him, and it's a similar sort of journey of them finding spirituality. And then recently I've been thinking the most spiritual thing to do is to actually start a family and deal with all of that and what that entails, the things that are shown to you every single day. Of course, Cat Stevens also did that, but not before he became a Muslim. So there's all these very, very big shifts in consciousness and in the possibilities for people who are of that ilk in that moment, of what they could do and where they could go, what they were able to be exposed to. So these are just some really nice pictures, because of course they're still together today, and it's just really charming. And I just wish I could find an accurate birth time for her, but I can't. You can just see it reflected in his chart, how he just needed to. There's Neptune, so he's a dreamer in Libra. His wound in relationships is expanding through relationships. Everything is back into this Venusian thing, which is making a trine to his heart being in Gemini. His heart is in the air. He's transforming, revolutionary through communication and through the air. And his North Node direction he wants to be going is towards Gemini. So he's aligned in so many of these ways, and then having that really amazing midheaven in such a strong, healthy Capricorn, 29 degrees is giving him a huge amount of faith for the future, and not being eaten up, swallowed whole by the fame machine. So this is him in the 70s. I had a new decade dawned, and I had accomplished everything any young singer songwriter could achieve. What else was there to do but experiment beyond the fame and into the new life, regardless of the result? This is when he starts really recording a lot of children's albums, and this is when a lot of the music critics get very critical, and they describe it as twee and just dated and too traditional, and it's just so beautiful for me. And I just feel like a lot of his inner child work he did by making music for the kids, because the deep cynicism that was like of all of the love and all of the high ideals of the 60s, the reality was so much was just highlighted and spoken freely about, and then there was a deep cynicism in the 70s, and then obviously all of the economic crisis that followed, and nihilism, and what he was doing at that moment would seem just like plain ridiculous. So of course his audience is just going to become the only optimists left, who are the kids. And you can really see it had a huge impact on a lot of young people with films like the Pied Piper, and I find it really magical. I find it as him finally kicking into all of his own Saturn, because it's intriguing that he's got Saturn in Cancer down here, that wound in the third house of communication. And then he's got in the midheaven this kind of saving grace of Capricorn strength. So it's like the most natural, the kind, if this is Saturn in its fall, it being in Cancer, then this is the kindest way it could be placed in a person's chart, because everything else is helping him with the communication, with the wound. Even his Chiron there is sat nestled between two big mighty planets. So he's just he's very well taken care of by his own chart. And of course, this is the moment that I want to bring up the fact in the 73 released Cosmic Wheels, an album which involves a lot of astrology language and a lot of leaning towards the cosmos and the magic. And one line being, God is playing marbles with his planets and his stars, creating havoc through my life with his influence on Mars, which is very, very funny. And as I say this, I'm suddenly noticing the conjunction that he has between Pluto and Mars in Leo. So this taking action for the generation, the Pluto generation of, and there he is on television performing with a guitar, in a way that had never been that accessible before then. Like, I think it's quite difficult for us to understand now how difficult it was to really hear music and share music and to find music. Like, you had very little choice, a lot of control over the industry. The industry is just a completely different thing now. And here's him speaking about being a Taurus. I'm a Taurus, and the Taurus's area is the throat. I'm very highly skilled with vocalizing. I can really impress and project a very special feeling. And it's just so true. And he doesn't comment on the fact that it's all this Gemini that's helping assist that, from the ascendant through his heart of Venus, through transformation of Uranus, and his North Node trajectory is all about expressing and being basically 10 times the Bob Dylan. And all with the assistance of a relationship that is just like what happens when you actually choose love, when you actually put love before anything else, and then how that can improve the quality of life more than any awards from an external source could be. And that's him going back into his introversion, which was always sort of protected. He could sing as much as he liked, because the reality was there's so much happening inside, and people just wanted to shut up and listen. All they're really seeing is the Taurus sun, the Aries quick wit, and then this steady, strong Capricorn midheaven. So it's an incredibly stabilizing and grounding. But then what they're feeling coming through the words is all the other stuff, including this deep sadness and wounding around how we express and how we have relationships. And he can just kind of work through them, and then it starts getting reflected as his voice is refined and as his as he's really embodying his ancestry as well. You know, he really goes back to the old Scottish "We timorous beasties" and the Jabberwocky and all of these old Burns poems and things, and yeah, just really not caring about the critics whatsoever, and then that being his saving grace. And then just him as an oracle, you know, it's so easy to say now, you know, everyone knew this was coming, but saying have some fun out in the country, celebrate your music in the open air, people dance for miles around to the music maker. Didn't have electronic music for more than half of the last century, and then just the ability to have stacks and speakers that could project for miles and miles and miles, and being able to have masses and masses of people together all dancing for a united cause that was really started with Woodstock. And yeah, it's something that we really had intensively, consistently since the 60s until last year, when some kind of block had been put on us by this pandemic. Such an interesting period of time. And then just to bring it back to how I discovered him, and I discovered him because his music was being used as the opening soundtrack for Britannia, a TV series about the Celts in Britain and when the Romans came back for a second time. And just trying to feel into, I mean, the Celts were all across any Atlantic coast from Spain, Portugal, France, and the British Isles. Really, really prevalent and really engaged with pagan things and with the seasons and Romans coming in and how they could, you know, Romans being Saturn. You know, I really see Saturnian themes in Rome, of control, of incredible bridges and roads, bridges and roads, bridges and roads. And just before they were there, really, the British Isles, the Wise Isles, were blanketed in forest from Devon till the Highlands. These kind of programs, especially like these really cool kind of Game of Thrones style things with lots of action and just kind of re-owning what it might be to be in and of the land. That's what we're all craving. And so we sit in front of these boxes and we see projections of it and stories of it, and then the music kind of takes you somewhere in your heart, and the imagery. And at least for me, I don't know, I suppose it will be a reflection on how many people actually watch this presentation, but for me it's the amount of focus that's put on historical dramas and the Vikings and these kinds of things is an indication that there's something that we're missing, that we crave. And you know, the hurdy-gurdy man is a man on his own who is connected to the nature, eating magic mushrooms, eating the berries that he knows are safe, and working with the runes and not needing to eat for long periods of time, and getting filthy and communicating with the gods and knowing that he's possessed, and just he's a self-possessed man in that way. Like, he really has himself and knows himself, and he knows when he's not himself. And then the season of the witch being about this young girl who's coming up and taking her power and gaining the muscles, and she's fasting for long periods of time and finding her power within the moon and sleeping in the forest on the floor. All things that we, you know, well, I've done this myself, and it does something to your psyche to be able to connect to nature in that way, as I know that Donovan did. It says something that his voice, which was ringing through the spheres from the 60s, is now heard by more people now with new ears. And this is an interesting thing about music, and it's the same with any form of artistry, that it can resonate if it comes before its time. It can resonate for other reasons at another period of time. Also, with what the planets are doing, they come into certain alignments again and again. and the huge conjunction with Saturn and Pluto and Jupiter is something that doesn't come around too often, the interaction between these particular planets. And this is the archetype. This is the archetype of Saturn with Rome, and then the archetype of something more Neptunian, and then Uranus wanting to marry the deep space, the deep more superstitious realms of the dream world. We're relying on intuition and strange sacrifices and ideas, and then stripping that back to what's actually useful, and then warming up a lot of the coldness and hardness and rigidity of Saturn, and all with the vehicle of Uranus, which is the transformation. And it's interesting when you look at his chart, it's not anything taking place in Aquarius or the 11th house, but that doesn't matter, because what he was living through was the dawning of the age of Aquarius. And then he's bringing in the very humanistic qualities to that new paradigm as it's being introduced, and sort of just being a snowplow, being a leader and going ahead for us and testing the waters. And he was a very safe person to do that, considering his chart had him so grounded within himself from birth. One thing I wanted to mention about all of his self-sacrifice, and it can sometimes be quite confusing to have all of this people-pleasing tendency and need for relationship and need for others, and then and do lots for them, constantly playing for everyone, but then also love what you're doing and live for it, and to know where to draw the line between when you're doing something just for the sake of someone else and when you're really enjoying the flow. And I think he found that balance in his life really well. And considering that so much of his life took place, from birth, he's here to bring the beauty, to bring the Venusian quality to us, and to show us how to live in harmony and love. Venus, after all, is love. And he's done a wonderful job of that. And considering so much happened when he was young, to go through all of this, the protests against the Vietnam War, but with a he's very much like Joan Baez in this way, that consistent. I'm more interested to find out about his family, and I have read that he's written an autobiography, so be interesting, after I've done this assessment, to then see, how accurate I am within his own autobiography and how he says the story of himself. But it's all there in his songs anyway. And I watched one about Joan Baez, someone else who slipped my attention completely, and she came from a very nice family, like really loving family, heart-centered family, and it meant that she had very little doubts and very little personal trauma to work through, and she could give herself wholeheartedly 100% to the cause against the Vietnam War in favor of peace. We shall overcome, we shall overcome. Just with like the deep sorrow she had was just for the collective. And I'd like to know more about Donovan Leitch's father, Donovan Leitch, and I've heard more of him said about his father than his mother, and it's interesting to have the father planet of Saturn in the mother house, the mother sign of Cancer. Yeah, just the thing I get from this whole chart is he wants to bring as much peace within his own life and within the life of as many people as he could touch, and then that's him satisfied. And I think it's a really beautiful simplicity. Personal battle was one to get his true love, and it's very, very funny, because it's like, as much as this is all happening out in the open on stage and the humiliation and everything, it's like it was always such a personal inward journey. And that's the thing with relationships, it's always completely unique to the two people within it. And it's funny that we obsess and we get so deeply interested in the relationships of famous people, when it's absolutely impossible to know inside of a single couple's relationship unless you are one of them, because we're all working with these individual charts. So yes, thank you for joining me today in this exploration of this amazing singer, this amazing performer, this family man, and this inspiration for us all. I just want to express a gratitude at being able to look at a life in this way, and to have access to someone's birth details, to see someone on this very, very personal, intimate level, is in a way which is not just as a voyeur, but as a greater reflection for the rest of us to be inspired by and to learn from. And we were just talking recently about how many psychological thrillers there are, and how many really amazing psychological stories and understanding there is now. And just wondering, why does it always have to be about psychopaths and murderers? And why can it not be about how somebody was using their psychology in a really positive direction, really benefited a lot of people, and there wasn't actually a tragedy, and because even now, if you see something with a happy ending, it's only ever the ending that's happy. It's always like drama, 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 and then happy. Whereas with Donovan, I like the fact that it's just a little drama in the beginning, but nothing too heavy, and then a lot of extensive peace. Thank you for joining me here today. And Donovan, if you watch this, I'm very grateful for you sharing your birth details with the world. So thank you.